Alright, this is the third video in section 23. We're going to be talking more about evolution in populations. Keep in mind that individuals do not evolve, but populations do. How do populations evolve? By changes in the allele frequencies, which we spoke about with the Hardy-Weinberg. So we're going to look at 4 or 5 different ways that allele frequencies can change in populations. The first one on that list was natural selection. Natural selection will occur only if one variation of a trait has a selective advantage as deemed by the environment. So that would create a high or a low level of fitness. So if fitness is involved, then environment is favoring one variation of a trait over another, and allele frequencies can change. The second is genetic drift, which once we're going to be doing a driftworm activity. It's a quick activity so you can actually see how genetic drift occurs, and you'll see why genetic drift has absolutely zero effect on large populations, and you'll see why genetic drift can have a really big role in small populations. So we'll be looking at how genetic drift can occur in small populations to change allele frequencies. Basically, genetic drift works like this. Genetic drift is strictly based off of randomness and by chance, just because some genes become more common than others. The founder effect is a bit of an extension on genetic drift, and it occurs, partly by chance. So in this population, in the larger circle here, we see 2 subpopulations, subgroup A and subgroup B. How the founder affects is essentially like this. Subgroup A in this bigger population, for whatever reason, they decide to shimmy on out of the population, move somewhere else. I don't know. Maybe the government of beetles right here is not going in their favor, so they decide they're going to move over here and start up their own country. So they do. They leave, and they're now in an entirely different setting. They're in their own isolated habitat, well away from that initial population. And as a result of being the founding fathers, so to speak, they're going to reproduce. And what will their offspring look like? Well, as you can imagine, the offspring will all look like the parents. Notice that back in our original population, we had some red-colored beetles in there and some other variation of patterns, but it was these guys that happened to leave. We see yellow with a lot of dots, yellow with 2 dots, and then solid black. And that's what we're going to have in our founding fathers. 2 dots, a lot of spots, and then black and black. And that's because of who their founding fathers were, and these coloration patterns were heritable traits. However, if the founding fathers happen to look like this, then these traits will be passed on to subsequent generations, and the children would look like this. Notice that solid black beetle is not included in this growing population over here because those genes were not included in the few beetles that established it. I'd like to reiterate that we're looking at allele frequencies changing in populations, but not in the species as a whole. This population of beetles and this population of beetles are still the same species. They just live separately from one another. A third way that allele frequencies can shift is called the bottleneck effect, which is really almost the same as the founder effect, except it's a result of a catastrophe. In this case, the individuals that survive are really completely random, and whichever few members happen to survive that catastrophe, well, they're the ones whose traits are going to be used in the repopulation of the species. In the bottleneck effect, and the growing repopulation, it isn't necessarily the best suited individuals that survive this catastrophe. It's a catastrophe. Maybe if we're talking about those beetles like we were looking at a moment ago, some beetles just happen to be in the right place at the right time to survive that catastrophe. Even though they might be favored against by the environment, they happen to be in the right place at the right time. So the bottleneck effect doesn't take into account so much of a favored trait, so to speak. It is completely random, and it does occur when a large chunk of a population gets wiped out by a catastrophe, and those few members that do survive, well, they pass their traits on to the next generations as repopulation begins. Gene flow is another way to disrupt allele frequencies in populations. Once again, going to reiterate, we're talking about allele frequencies in populations, not within the entire species. So if we go back a few slides here to those beetles, what would this population begin to look like if one of these black beetles moved into their population? Well, that black beetle would probably start to mate with some of the other beetles, and you would probably start to see some black beetles start to become more and more common in this population as it grows over time. So, gene flow is a result of immigration or emigration. Once again, differentiation between the two. Immigration is when individuals move into a population, and emigration is when individuals exit a population. So taking a closer look at natural selection, we're going to be talking about relative fitness. And we spoke about fitness previously, ability to survive and reproduce, and that's kind of what relative fitness is. However, struggle for existence and survival of the fittest are accurate descriptions of natural selection, but can be misleading. And that's strictly in how they are worded. They make it appear as if organisms actually physically compete with one another, and the stronger of the two organisms survives while the other dies. This isn't necessarily the case. They mean that all organisms have to struggle within the environment in order to survive, and that those that do survive because the environment favors them in some way, shape, or form. This is also the case with survival of the fittest. There isn't a competition going on. There's just organisms that simply are better suited for the environment, and those organisms will survive. So talking about the term relative fitness here in terms of struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, we're meaning this. The contribution one individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation relative to the contributions of other individuals. So thinking about my generation of humans for this specific example here, what contribution do I make to the next generation compared to other individuals? Well, I have like 1 7/8 of a kid right now, and I'm going to generate or contribute 2 individuals into the next population or next generation. But what about John and Kate plus 8 from several years ago? They have quite a few more kids than me, so they're making a higher contribution to the next generation. So in terms of relative fitness, they have a higher relative fitness than I. Continuing on with natural selection, we're going to introduce the bell curve, which I'm sure is probably not exactly new to you, but it does come into play as we move forward with natural selection a little bit. And I just discovered this nifty little pen here, so you're going to see me slaughter some screens here with my awesome penmanship. But anyhow, in the bell curve, we see a pattern just like we have on the screen right here, where it's shaped like a bell, ding dong. And what this is showing us is that most people are right at the average for any given trait. It could be length of your nose, how much webbing you have between your pinky and ring finger, your height, eye color, whatever. Most people are average for any given trait. You have some people that are above average, so if we're talking height, you have a few Shaquille O'Neals up here, but those individuals are few and far between. And you'll have some people that are really, really short, and those people are few and far between. But for any trait, most people are right at about the average. So we're going to take a look at 3 different scenarios where the environment favors the different groups of people that we see on our screen here. So the 3 things that can occur when below average, average, or above average individuals are favored will be directional, stabilizing, or disruptive selection, depending on who is favored by the environment. And keep in mind, this doesn't necessarily happen just for humans. This happens for all living things, provided that one group has a selective advantage as determined by the environment. And the first would be directional selection. At the beginning of chapter 23, you were introduced to a scenario in 1976 where there was a drought and a lot of the small soft seeds in the environment went out, but there was hard large seeds still available. And the thing you were looking at happened to be birds. So in those birds, most birds were average for beak length. Some birds had really tiny beaks, and some birds had really, really large beaks. Well, in that particular scenario, these birds had a selective advantage. They were able to crack open those seeds that were big and hard, and they were able to eat them. As a result, these guys were able to survive better than the birds with small beaks and the birds with average beaks. Because they were able to survive better, they were able to have more children in the following generation. So what happened to the next generation of birds? Well, the next generation of birds, there was a lot more with these large beaks. There was almost none with the small beaks, so they declined dramatically, and most birds, the average, it decreased as well. So we have a shift in which traits are more common. With those birds, the large beaks became more common, and as a result, the average was no longer right here. The average shifted over here. And what we ended up having was a bell curve that moved from right there to right over there. In other words, it shifted in a direction. That's directional selection. That could also happen if the birds with small beaks had a selective advantage. The average would shift in that direction. But it's not both at the same time, it's one or the other. And I told you I was going to slaughter this, so you have fun with that. We'll pick up with disruptive and stabilizing selection in the next video here.